Eleanor Whitmore slid a $2 million check across the table, not even looking the man in the eye. We both know money cannot buy every fix, and 11 expensive experts had already failed. Her father's 1971 Lamborghini Miura still sat in the glass garage like a $4 million coffin. Untouched, silent, hidden under black velvet. But the guy standing in front of her today was different. No expensive suit. Just a blue work uniform with grease on his hands, completely ignoring her massive check. He didn't care about the millions. He just asked, "Fuse number 7, has anyone replaced it?" One working-class mechanic, a simple $9 question, and her entire world was about to shake. Eleanor Whitmore stood alone in the glass garage at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It was her usual routine during every visit to her father's estate over the past 3 years. The room was 400 square, meters of polished concrete and towering glass walls. Let's step inside. It was custom built for a man who loved engines like music. Only one vehicle sat in the center of the room. The 1971 Lamborghini Miura P400 SV, painted a yellow so deep it looked like hardened sunlight, sleeping untouched beneath its dark velvet cover. Bright overhead halogen lights cast a glow that made the entire scene feel completely sacred. Eleanor stood right by the cover but chose not to lift it. She just stared at the silhouette under the cloth and breathed. The air still smelled of old leather and motor oil. It held that heavy, quiet stillness that only exists when something precious is locked away, waiting to be found again. Her father, Joseph Whitmore, had been incredibly loud in the best possible way. At 68 years old, he filled every room he entered, not just with noise, but with pure energy, laughing at his own jokes and sharing wine with total strangers. He instantly remembered the name of every single person he met. He used to race cars for fun in his 40s, never professionally. But his sheer competitive joy always thrilled the crowd and kept his crew on edge. This classic car was his second great love, right behind his wife, Margaret. He bought it in 1988 at a Geneva auction and flew it straight home. Then he spent 3 months restoring it himself in their driveway back in Oak Park. During the summer of 1991, they took a road trip through 12 states in 22 days. No plans, no hotels, just two lovers, a screaming V12 engine, and the open road. Eleanor spent her childhood staring at the old photographs on the hallway wall, seeing her mother's hair blowing wild in the open air, her father's hand gripping the wheel, both smiling like crazy teenagers. She memorized those beautiful moments before she could even read. On the very night Margaret died, the vintage supercar sat idling in the garage. Joseph was warming it up for an early morning cruise the next day. It was a routine he kept year-round. At 11:47 that night, while Eleanor rushed to the hospital and her dad sat in the waiting room with cold coffee, the engine suddenly died. Imagine the shock, no warning, no sputter. 1 second it was purring, the next dead. When Joseph finally returned home 3 days later, the vehicle remained completely untouched. He just walked inside, stared at the quiet machine, and stood there in absolute silence. Finally, he turned to Eleanor, who was standing beside him. To him, the vintage car only died because Margaret had called it home. He spoke with the desperate conviction of a man trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Eleanor didn't fight him. She just threw the velvet cover back over the chassis and took him home. And Joseph, once an unstoppable force of nature, slowly started to fade away into the quiet. He stopped eating regular meals. He stopped answering his phone. He drifted through his days like a guest who was already stepping out the door. Within 18 months, he ended up at Mercy General, his lungs slowly giving out. It was that quiet, devastating way grief speeds up the inevitable. The call that completely changed Eleanor's plans came from Dr. Isaac Brennan, exactly 3 weeks before she eventually hired Lucas Grant. Dr. Brennan was a highly precise man, choosing his words like a master watchmaker selecting tiny gears. He warned Eleanor that while modern medicine could keep her father stable, it couldn't save him. It couldn't reverse the decline. The only real variable now was his motivation. "Your father has simply stopped wanting to get better," Dr. Brennan explained. "I've watched this sad process play out in patients before. When someone decides their future holds far less than the life behind them, the body naturally follows that choice. What your father needs right now is a genuine reason to look forward to tomorrow. Eleanor asked what that meant in the real world. The doctor paused. I'm not entirely sure, but he has brought up that classic car 4 times during our last 2 visits. Once describing how the engine roars at full throttle. Another time he talked about how the gearbox feels on a winding mountain road. And the last 2 times he simply whispered that he truly missed it. Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, then she whispered, I will fix it. Driving straight to the estate, she stepped into the cold garage at 11 that night and ripped the cover away. She stared at the classic Lamborghini's unblinking headlights under the harsh lights, then called her assistant, Diana. Get me the absolute best vintage Lamborghini restorer in the nation, she ordered. Price is not an issue. But throwing millions of dollars at the problem was exactly the wrong strategy. Within 48 hours, she had kicked off a long, incredibly frustrating parade of overpriced experts. In the first 2 weeks, 3 famous specialists arrived directly from Los Angeles. They carried thick, expensive business cards and egos that barely fit inside the garage. They quickly diagnosed a blocked fuel line, demanding $180,000 to rebuild it. Eleanor approved it instantly without arguing. The mechanics worked with a dramatic, showy precision, implying success was completely guaranteed. Their billing was immaculate and incredibly expensive. The long report explaining their progress filled 4 entire pages. But the car didn't start. Naturally, they offered another costly assessment. Eleanor kicked them out. By week 3, she flew in another expert from Miami. This was Adriano, an Italian engineer who actually worked at the Lamborghini factory back in the 1980s. He brought the absolute authority of a man who had touched the original supercars. He spent exactly 35 minutes inspecting the vehicle. He spoke in sharp, confident sentences. They claimed the V12 engine block had fatal internal issues and demanded a total $1 million rebuild. $320,000, 6 weeks. He knew she would pay. 6 weeks later, that $1 million engine was completely silent. It took 7 phone calls for the expert to answer. He insisted his work was perfect. The problem had to be something else. She never called back. By week 8, waves of expensive specialists were crowding her garage. First, 2 luxury restoration firms from New York who charged top dollar. Then came a fancy Scottsdale team specializing in elite show cars. Priceless consultants from Chicago and Atlanta arrived. Their resumes were perfect, their results non-existent. Every expert had a theory, and every theory cost a fortune. They replaced the carburetors, the ignition coils, the distributor cap, and even the timing chain. They bought a fuel pump that cost $22,000, only to throw it away when nothing changed. Another expert spent 4 days tracing the electrical system, leaving 40 pages of useless notes in a car that remained just as dead as the day he got there. After 11 of these high-priced specialists had failed, Eleanor spent $1.7 million, but the classic car wouldn't whisper. The last expensive expert before Lucas Grant was named Adrian Mercer, a 52-year-old Beverly Hills legend who wrote books on Italian car restoration. He was a regular star in major car magazines. He was the undisputed master of vintage Lamborghinis in North America, rolling up in a silver shadow with 3 assistants in tow. He stared at the engine for barely 20 seconds, then turned to deliver his verdict with the absolute arrogance of a millionaire who believed he was completely incapable of making mistakes. The wiring in these early Miuras is as complex as a Swiss watch, he declared. Those other amateurs were just guessing. They missed the source of the trouble. I will replace the entire wiring system, every single inch. $400,000, 3 weeks, guaranteed results. She asked if he had actually tested the parts before making such a massive claim. Adrian smiled with total confidence. He looked at her like a master who saw careful testing as a waste of time meant only for amateurs. 30 years of absolute perfection, he sneered, means I do not need to double-check. She signed his contract anyway. 3 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday, Adrian called her assistant, demanding to speak with Eleanor. He spent 10 minutes bragging about how flawlessly his new wiring had been installed. He claimed the electrical system was now completely brand new, but since the vehicle still would not start, the actual defect must be a fundamental unfixable factory defect built directly into her chassis. An unfixable error in a handful of early P400 SV units that nobody could ever fix. He refunded half his fee, flew back to California, and never offered an apology. That night, Eleanor stood in her pitch-black garage all alone, surrounded by silence and nearly $2 million in completely useless, failed repairs. She stared at the covered Miura, a $1 million mystery sitting silent in the cold light of her father's massive estate. She stood frozen. The failed repairs already totaled $1,700,000. 11 elite experts, 3 years of silence, and a priceless car that refused to run. She rubbed her tired eyes, realizing money couldn't buy a solution. With no one watching, she called Diana first thing the next morning. "I do not want another high-priced expert," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, carrying the quiet defeat of someone who had spent millions for nothing. "I want a real mechanic who knows engines, not some fancy, expensive reputation. No high-priced resumes, just someone who actually cares about these machines." Diana was silent for a second on the other end of the phone. It was the kind of silence that meant she had a cheap blue-collar alternative. "I know someone," Diana said, "but you will not like his cheap address." Grant Auto was crammed into a narrow brick building on a side street, a gritty working-class suburb located 8 miles west of the Chicago Loop, squeezed between a commercial tire warehouse and a shop with a completely faded sign. The front was cheap corrugated metal, painted a shade that had once been green. Above the roll-up door, a worn sign read Grant Auto in letters repainted at least twice. Each layer was slightly thicker than the last. When Diana arrived at 8:15 on Wednesday morning, the main bay door was open. Classic rock was blasting from a dusty little radio sitting on a shelf nearby, and a pair of old work boots was sticking out from under an old 1984 Chevrolet Caprice raised on jack stands. Diana explained the job, talking directly to the rusty underside of the car and the legs beneath it. The boots went completely still. "What year is the Miura?" The voice called out from under the chassis. 1971. The rolling board slid out and Lucas Grant sat up. He was 31 years old, with messy brown hair pushed back and the kind of grease-covered hands that revealed exactly how he earned his living. Knuckles calloused, fingernails kept short. A faint scar ran along his right thumb, with the result of a cheap line that had burst without warning 4 years ago. He stared at Diana. Is it a P400 SV or an SVJ? She didn't know. Lucas stood up, wiped his hands on a greasy rag and said, "Give me the address." Lucas had originally enrolled in the automotive engineering program at Illinois Institute of Technology at 19, dropping out at 21. Not because of bad grades, but because his father, Raymond Grant, suffered a major stroke right in the middle of his junior year, leaving him unable to run the garage he had owned for 26 years. Lucas packed his bags, came home, and never went back. He told himself for years that he would finish his degree eventually. It was a fiction he completely gave up on by age 25. The neighborhood regulars became his own, and the rhythm of the garage shaped his entire life. But the one thing he never stopped doing was reading. His back office shelf held 40 years of factory service manuals, technical journals, and original factory manuals in Italian, German, French, and Japanese. Most were collected by his father, the rest scored by Lucas at dusty estate sales. He gathered records from dead mechanics whose families did not know what to do with 300 pounds of old manuals. His Lamborghini Miura section took up half a shelf and held the original factory wiring diagrams for every single year between 1966 and 1973, printed on paper that had worn translucent at the folds. Lucas had read every single page. He studied them like novels, not just to memorize raw numbers, but to understand the logic of a specific mind solving a specific set of complex problems. He printed the 1971 schematic before leaving his shop, folding it neatly into his breast pocket. The meeting at the Grand Whitmore estate was tense for both of them, which meant it was honest, unlike Eleanor's expensive meetings with those self-proclaimed specialists. She watched Lucas quietly step through the garage side door. No knock, no formal announcement, the door was wide open, and she let the silence stretch out before saying a word. He was nothing like the men she expected, which says everything about what 11 highly paid specialists had trained her to expect. "You are the person Diana found?" she asked. Lucas looked at her without the usual fake respect she was used to getting. "I am whoever is left," he said, not sounding aggressive. "It was just a fact." Eleanor explained the whole story in 4 minutes. 11 experts, 1,700, 0 results. She set a $2 million check on the tool cabinet near the car and laid out the terms. Fix it, the check is his. Fail, and she pays $500 for his time, then he leaves. Lucas did not even glance at the money, he only saw the car. He circled the vehicle once, slowly, keeping both hands at his sides. His eyes traced from the roof to the sills, then to the rear engine cover and back. Reaching the front of the car, he laid one hand flat on the hood very gently, like a doctor placing a hand on a patient to feel what complex machines miss, and stood perfectly still for a moment. Then he turned to Eleanor, asking, "When the engine cut out that night, was it instant or did it sputter for a few seconds and then die?" Eleanor paused to think. "It was instant," she replied. "My father said it was running 1 second and dead the next." Lucas gave a single nod. "That is the first question anyone has asked me that was not about expensive parts," Eleanor murmured. Lucas was already moving back to the front of the car, reaching down for the hood release lever. He ignored the heavy diagnostic computers that those 3 previous experts had wheeled in on expensive carts. Instead, he used a simple LED flashlight he pulled right from his jacket pocket, and that single paper wiring diagram he printed earlier that morning. He worked in absolute silence, tracing his fingers down each wire bundle with the patience of a writer following a sentence to the end, slowly tracing the circuits backward from the terminal points to their source. Eleanor stood 6 feet away, watching silently without speaking. Diana stood by the door. 8 minutes went by and then Lucas froze. His hand stopped right near the simple fuse block mounted on the wall behind the passenger seat. They built a grid of 42 individual fuses, each ruling a tiny piece of this $1 million machine. He kept his cheap flashlight locked on position 7. He stayed quiet for a second, then said, "Come here." As the billionaire approached, he pointed the beam at fuse number 7, the main circuit that fed fuel to the entire engine, the one tiny component that could instantly kill a roaring engine without a single warning. No engine sputtering, no warning sounds, none of the typical noise of a car losing fuel or spark. "A naturally blown fuse," he explained, "always has a melted wire inside. You will always see the black char at the break point. But this one," he lifted the cheap part into the light, "has a perfect unbroken wire. It never blew, someone just pulled it out." He looked right at the Heiress. "Someone pulled this out by hand. Your question shouldn't be about how cheap the replacement is. It is who took it out and why." She instantly refused to believe it. Not because of his words, but because of the massive conspiracy it implied. She had wasted $1.7 million on elite mechanics when his answer was a simple $9 part. The billionaire stood perfectly still, crossing her arms in silence. "Are you sure?" she asked. It was more of a demand, but he did not flinch. He held the cheap piece of plastic under the flashlight, laying out the raw truth with total calm. "You and I know the truth often hides in the gaps between what people assume and what is real. A genuinely blown fuse always snaps and leaves obvious heat damage at the break. This cheap part was perfectly fine. The wire was unbroken, clean, and undamaged by heat. It had sat in its slot, keeping the circuit alive for years, until someone physically pulled it from the mount. Not shaken loose, not corroded, but deliberately stolen." She stared at the cheap $9 part in silence. Then she asked if they could pull up the security footage from 3 years ago. Her assistant was already reaching for her phone. The massive security system kept 90 days of regular video, but saved important events forever on the server. Any movement, any open door, or system change triggered an automatic save, locked away on their private servers forever. The night Margaret Whitmore died was safely preserved, triggered by the garage motion sensor at 11:47 p.m. Diana loaded the old tape on a laptop sitting on a nearby tool cabinet. They stood side by side and watched. At 11:47 and 9 seconds, a side door slowly swung open. Not the massive driveway door, but the private entrance leading straight from the mansion. A man in dark clothes slipped into the garage. He walked with the calm ease of someone who owned the place. He walked straight to the vintage Lamborghini, never once looking around. with zero hesitation like he had practiced this exact path before. He popped the hood and leaned inside for about 40 seconds. Then he shut it and walked right back the way he entered. He was gone in exactly 4 minutes and 13 seconds. They spent a fortune on that security camera, but its grainy, wide-angle image was designed to scare intruders, not actually identify them. The intruder's face was a complete blur, but those shoes were crystal clear. Brown leather Oxfords, high-vamped, with a very specific double-stitched toe cap. The kind of shoe only serious money buys. Memorable enough to stand out and unique enough to get him caught. Eleanor stared at the screen in absolute silence. She was frozen for 4 long seconds. Lucas watched her face instead of the screen. "You know those shoes," he said flatly. Eleanor didn't answer, she just turned to Diana. "Get me the house access logs for that specific night," she ordered. "I want every entry and exit going back 12 hours from midnight." Sebastian Crane pulled up to the estate that afternoon, just like every Thursday. He was unannounced but expected. A years-old routine of delivering his high-stakes weekly financial briefings to Eleanor on the state of the empire. He was 45 years old. Fit, with silver hair and the kind of sharp, expensive grooming that signaled power without looking vain. He had been with the company for 20 years, serving the last 7 as chief financial officer. He had been so close to Joseph that decades of professional loyalty looked like family. He spotted the open hood of the Lamborghini. A grease-stained mechanic in simple work clothes was leaning deep into the engine bay. Sebastian's face twitched slightly, a subtle tightening of his jaw. A split second of pure tension before he quickly masked it, replacing it with warm, casual curiosity. "Another high-priced specialist?" he asked Eleanor as she walked out to greet him. "I thought you'd given up on that." Eleanor replied that she hadn't. Sebastian eyed Lucas. "Who is this?" Lucas stood up and studied him coolly, the way a smart observer files away a critical piece of evidence. Eleanor introduced Lucas as her hired mechanic. Sebastian gave a smug smile, clearly amused by the lowly title, and politely excused himself. He was halfway to the house when Lucas's gaze dropped straight to his feet. Those brown Oxfords, high vamp, and that double-stitched toe. Lucas said nothing, turning back to the engine to work. By evening, Diana's expensive security logs revealed everything. Sebastian had logged into the main house at 11:31 p.m. the night Margaret died, his usual Thursday visit. He finally slipped out at 12:04 a.m. The garage motion sensor tripped at 11:47. The digital timeline was absolutely flawless. Lucas snapped a photo of the log, texted it to Eleanor, and left it at that. Eleanor was sitting in her father's massive study when the phone buzzed. She read the text once, then laid the screen flat on her desk. But she picked it back up to read it again. Then she dialed her high-priced personal attorney, Alexander Rourke, directly at home. It was exactly 7 minutes past 10 p.m. "I want a deep financial audit," she ordered. 3 years of every single transaction Sebastian Crane ever signed off on. Focus on all mineral rights, extraction contracts, and land transfers. Rourke promised he would start investigating by morning. Eleanor thanked him and ended the call. She sat in the dark study, resting in the chair her father had used every morning for 40 years. She stared into the dark, thinking of 11 elite specialists, nearly $2 million, and his $9 answer. And she thought about Sebastian Crane, the man who worked beside her father for 20 years and stood in this very room. He stood in the garage the night Margaret died, pocketing a cheap fuse to keep it broken. The paper trail arrived in 2 separate rounds. The first summary landed the next morning at 6:47. A land rights transfer signed 3 years earlier. It handed valuable mining rights in southern Colorado over to a holding company called Crane Allied Resources, a $340 million contract. And signing for Whitmore Industries was her sick father, Joseph. He had been admitted to Mercy General 11 days before they made him sign. His confidential medical records, which Eleanor legally accessed, proved he was on a constant morphine drip. He was heavily medicated, leaving him with almost zero mental clarity during that critical signing window. No family attorney was present to protect him. The second round of results came at noon, detailing the scam. The hidden commission structure in the contract had quietly directed $48 million in advisory fees directly to Crane over the next 30 months. The massive payouts bounced through 3 dummy accounts before settling. And buried deep in the appendix, written in incredibly dense, confusing legal jargon, was a sneaky clause designed by someone betting nobody would read it closely. Was a secret collateral clause. It stated that if the family ever sold off certain valuable personal assets, including the vintage 1971 Lamborghini Miura, those massive Colorado extraction rights would transfer permanently and irrevocably to Crane Allied Resources. You see, the classic supercar had to stay broken. If she finally sold the car, which she surely would after wasting nearly $2 million on useless mechanics, Sebastian would win everything. But Lucas didn't go home that night. He sat in the garage on an upside-down bucket. The classic car's hood was open, his work light shining. He studied every invoice and repair order left behind by those 11 expensive specialists, reading their dense notes like complex wiring diagrams, searching for the logic they missed. He finally spotted it, buried on the last page of a 43-page bill. Hidden right under a charge for third-party consulting was an $85,000 payoff to an unnamed vendor with only a routing number. Lucas took a photo. He sent it to her with a simple text. "I'm no detective, but someone paid to keep this car broken." Eleanor was still awake. She read his text, walked down to the garage, and stopped at the door. Lucas was sitting on his cheap bucket, the work light casting long shadows, while the open hood of the Miura framed him. Eleanor stared at him for a quiet moment. "How much do you know?" she asked. "I know what I see," he said. "The rest is your problem." "It's becoming everyone's problem," Eleanor said. She sat on a cheap plastic bucket, something a billionaire never did here. And they stayed like that in the quiet. 2 people under the lights, a $1 million car between them. Sebastian Crane showed up the next morning without an appointment. It was unusual enough that Diana warned Eleanor before he even reached the garage. He walked in with the cool composure of a wealthy man who has prepped his speech and wants to deliver it cleanly. Lucas worked at the front of the car. Eleanor had not arrived yet. Sebastian stopped just a few feet away, staring at Lucas for a quiet moment, measuring him the way a rich man sizes up an obstacle, not a person. "I am going to be direct," Sebastian said. "I do not know what you think you found, and I do not care. I will pay you $5 million cash to tell Eleanor Whitmore that this car cannot be repaired, then go back home. You will never work on a car worth over $10,000 again if you stay, but you get $5 million if you leave. This is a very straightforward offer." Lucas slowly stood up from where he was crouching. He stood slightly taller than Sebastian, and he looked considerably less polished than the executive. Grimy work clothes, oil-stained hands, and the face of a guy who is never surprised by anything. He stared at Sebastian for a long moment in silence. "Here is what I see," Lucas said. "You snuck into this garage the night Margaret Whitmore died and pulled the fuse out of this car. You paid Adrian Mercer $85,000 to ensure his work failed. And you wrote a sneaky contract clause that needed this car broken so you could seize a $340 million mineral deposit from a dying man on a morphine drip with no lawyer in the room. $5 million does not buy that." Sebastian's face went completely pale and still. The sudden silence of a criminal who just heard his dirty secrets listed aloud and is measuring the shortest path to the door. "You are a mechanic from Cicero," he sneered. "Nobody will believe a single word you say." Lucas locked eyes. "The camera will," Lucas replied. Sebastian bolted toward the exit. He moved fast without actually running, but with the tense urgency of a guy who knows the next few minutes decide his entire future. He burst through the garage door and froze. Eleanor Whitmore was standing in the hallway, holding her phone, with the voice recorder running. She had been listening the whole time. She heard every word. Sebastian stared at her, she stared back, and a heavy silence filled the space between them. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice remained quiet. She did not need to shout. "You worked alongside my father for 20 years, she said. "He trusted you like his own blood." Sebastian tried to stammer out an excuse. The contract was legal, the signature was genuine. The advisory fees were fully disclosed, but Eleanor raised her hand and cut him off. A signature taken from a man on constant morphine with no legal representation to sign a contract he could not understand is completely void. My lawyer has been working since 10 o'clock last night. And so is yours. Diana stepped into the hall behind Eleanor. Two heavy security guards silently blocked the exit behind her. Sebastian stared at Eleanor for one last quiet second. His eyes showed a hint of regret, but only because his expensive scheme had completely fallen apart. Then he quietly let the security team escort him out of the mansion. He did not say another word. Eleanor watched from the garage doorway as his expensive sedan sped away from the estate. The morning sunlight cut through the glass panels at a sharp angle, painting long pale stripes across the polished concrete floor. She stepped up to the nose of the classic Lamborghini, staring into the open engine bay. Lucas stood there holding the incredibly simple, cheap replacement fuse. Just a basic, hardware store ceramic fuse with the right amperage. He bought it at a local auto shop that morning for exactly $9, tax included. He spun the tiny part between his fingers, then looked up at Eleanor. "Do you want to plug it in?" he asked. She stared at this tiny $9 piece of plastic that had kept this $1 million machine silent for 3 long years. She shook her head. "Go ahead," she told him. Lucas pushed the cheap part into its holder with absolute care, like a man who knew this simple fix meant so much more than just connecting 2 wires. He took his time. The tiny piece clicked into place with a faint snap that barely made a sound in the quiet garage. He took a step back and looked at Eleanor. Eleanor walked over to the driver's side and opened the door. She climbed into the cockpit of the supercar for the first time in 3 years. The cabin smelled of old leather and that dry, dusty warmth unique to a classic car left untouched for ages, like a room locked away since the day its owner walked out. She gripped the steering wheel, her fingers trembling slightly as she held on. She slid the key into the ignition and turned it forward. Total silence at first. She tried one more time. The starter whined, spinning fast, and then the massive V12 engine roared to life. A deep, thunderous growl erupted from the back of the chassis and vibrated through the steel frame, echoing loudly right through the glass walls of the garage and out across the quiet morning estate. It was a violent, beautiful noise. This was a machine built to demand everyone's attention. 12 cylinders firing in a sequence that an Italian engineer spent 3 years perfecting back in the late 1960s. Eleanor sat frozen, hands tight on the steering wheel, completely speechless. Lucas stood by the open door, watching her reaction with a quiet smile. He did not need to speak. He just nodded, the quiet satisfaction of a man who solved a $1 million problem with a $9 fix. With the engine still screaming, Eleanor immediately dialed Dr. Isaac Brennan from the driver's seat. "I need approval to bring a very special car to the hospital parking lot," she said. "1 hour. I will have it back on the grounds by noon, Doctor." Brennan, their expensive specialist, put her on hold for 90 seconds. When he came back, the doctor said, "3rd floor, north-facing windows. Drive it right where he can see it from the window." The fading billionaire lay bedridden as that cheaply fixed vintage supercar pulled in below. His patient room was on the 3rd floor. His private nurse later noted in her daily log that at 9:52, Mr. Whitmore, unresponsive to all expensive medical treatments since last night, sat up unaided and turned to face the window. He just sat there for 11 minutes. Eleanor stood in the parking lot, her hand resting on the cheaply restored masterpiece, looking up. Joseph pressed his palm flat against the window glass. Looking up from 3 floors below, Eleanor saw him and waved back. Joseph muttered a single word that Eleanor could not hear through the glass. But his bedside nurse wrote it down, witnessing the moment in the room. He said, "She is still running." The nurse assumed he meant the car. When Eleanor was told about his words later, she knew he meant something far more profound, Doctor. Brennan's confused medical note from that very afternoon read, "Patient demonstrated a major positive response following simple external stimulus. Increased talking, better appetite, and requested the television remote for the first time in 6 weeks. The cause is unclear, will monitor." 12 weeks later, Joseph finally walked out of that expensive hospital. His lungs were permanently damaged beyond any high-priced cure, but he was finally strong enough to go home. He was finally strong enough to sit in a chair. He was well enough to eat meals at a table. He could walk slowly through the estate, stop at the garage door, and admire the car that was now kept completely uncovered. The expensive velvet dust cover sat folded away, the lights shining bright. The V12 engine was silent but present like a resting beast, alive even in its stillness. On his first afternoon back, he stood in the doorway and stared at it for a long time. Eleanor stood next to him. "You fixed the car," Joseph said. "Someone else fixed it," Eleanor said. "I just found the right person." Joseph was quiet for a moment. "That is harder," he said. 6 weeks after the advisor Sebastian Crane was thrown off the estate, he was formally indicted on 3 criminal charges. Massive financial fraud tied to the mineral rights deal, forging a signature on contracts from a victim who completely lacked legal capacity, plus conspiracy to block a lawful business investigation. This final charge came from his $85,000 payoff to Adrian Mercer. The $340 million extraction contract was declared void in Illinois court because the aging billionaire lacked capacity and was denied his own independent legal representation. Whitmore Industries clawed back all $48 million in fake advisory fees plus heavy interest. The greedy restorer Adrian Mercer settled, requiring him to repay the $85,000 and surrender his professional restoration certification in the state of Illinois. He accepted both terms without argument. Eleanor sent Lucas Grant a formal contract 3 days after he changed that fuse. Not for one simple repair, but to maintain and guard the entire $1 million Whitmore car collection. 17 rare machines, from a 1953 Jaguar to a 1982 Ferrari Berlinetta Boxer. The massive retainer would let him close his humble shop and move anywhere, without a single financial worry. Lucas thought about her offer for just 1 day. He returned with a single condition: his small shop in Cicero had to stay open. His garage would keep serving the neighborhood and its regular working-class customers. The rusted Caprices, the cheap Corollas, and the work trucks that needed brake jobs before winter, because that was his father's legacy, and because Lucas believed, in a simple way he never felt the need to over-explain, that if you stop listening to ordinary engines, you eventually forget how to listen at all. Eleanor studied him for a moment. "That is an unusual condition," she noted. Lucas shook his head. "No, it is the only reason I still know what I am doing." On a quiet Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the fraud case reached the state attorney, Eleanor sat alone in her dark garage with only the warm halogen spotlights turned on. The yellow beams fell across the gorgeous Miura, highlighting its classic lines. Shining from above, clean and direct, making the flawless yellow paint look like it was glowing from within. She had fired up the engine earlier. It purred now, incredibly steady and low. The glorious sound filled the modern glass room with the deep resonance of raw horsepower. A machine designed to roar, which had waited a very long time for this moment. She sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The gentle vibration of the idling engine traveled up the seat and directly into her spine. She thought of those 11 expensive specialists who arrived with grand credentials, supreme confidence, and useless theories. They all looked at a $4 million masterpiece and saw a $4 million problem. $1.7 million. Squandered on custom fuel systems, complex wiring harnesses, and ignition components. Wasted on everything except the simple question of what was missing. Then she pictured the mechanic in the blue uniform who walked into this garage and saw the vehicle exactly the way her late father once did. Not as a luxury asset, a wealthy headache, or a career challenge, but as a beautiful machine built with pure logic. A machine crafted with care, meaning there was a clear reason behind everything it did. And she pictured that cheap $9 fuse from slot number 7 sitting on a dusty shelf in the Cicero shop because Lucas had decided to keep it. Not as evidence for the lawyers, but simply because he believed it was a highly valuable lesson to remember. You see, some problems look absolutely massive until someone finally asks the right question. There are decades of silence that can end with a tiny click you can barely hear. And there are things that millions cannot buy, including the rare, priceless quality of true attention, which belongs to a mechanic who listened long before he ever charged for it. The classic engine purred inside the dark glass room. Patient, powerful, and deep, exactly how it was designed to run. While far away in a quiet house in the western suburbs, a humble mechanic slept peacefully. They searched for $1 million solution, while the silent old man sat by the window, staring at his dead vintage Lamborghini, remembering their wild road trip in 1991. Just two people, an open supercar, 12 states, and absolutely no itinerary. But with a cheap $9 answer, he wasn't sure if he was remembering or planning. And for the first time in a very long time, that uncertainty felt like something worth staying for.